African ghost DNA made the Neanderthal story look simple. For years, the famous shot came from outside Africa. Geneticists sequenced Neanderthal bones, set them beside the genomes of living people, and found that many non-Africans carried a small inheritance from a human group that had disappeared. That discovery hit hard because there was a body behind it. In 2010, researchers at the Max Planck Institute helped publish a draft Neanderthal genome. This extinct cousin had bones, caves, teeth, tools, and DNA that could sit next to living genomes on a lab screen. The African signal was different. Inside some modern African genomes, researchers started finding traces that did not fit the clean tree. The source was not a sequenced skull from a cold cave. It was not a named fossil species with a public genome. It was a missing branch, seen through patterns in living people. The old model looked tidy. People outside Africa carried Neanderthal ancestry because their ancestors left Africa and met Neanderthals somewhere in Eurasia. People inside Africa carried the deepest modern human roots, but not that same famous Neanderthal inheritance. Then the genome kept another record. The stranger signal was not the one with the Neanderthal name on it. It was African ghost ancestry, because it pointed to an unknown human population that left descendants without leaving an identified genome. To understand why that matters, the comparison has to start with the rules, because this subject can be misunderstood fast. This is not a ranking of people. It is not a ranking of intelligence, worth, purity, beauty, strength, or destiny. No living population is more human than another. No branch of ancestry makes a person superior, inferior, older in value, or closer to some imagined ladder of human progress. That caveat matters. Words like African, European, Asian, and non-African are broad labels in population genetics. They are not fixed racial boxes. They do not describe every person neatly, and they do not erase the enormous variation inside each region. Africa itself contains deeper genetic diversity than any single label can carry. This comparison is about ancestry signals. A signal is a trace in DNA, like a pattern of spelling changes along a chromosome. When many people share a stretch of DNA that looks unusually old, unusually divergent, or unusually similar to DNA from an ancient genome, geneticists ask where that stretch came from. Neanderthal ancestry is one kind of archaic introgression. Archaic means it came from an older human group, not from a less valuable kind of person. Introgression means DNA moved from one population into another after they had children together. In plain language, some modern human ancestors met Neanderthals, had families, and passed down small pieces of that ancient contact. Ghost lineage is harder. It means researchers infer a missing population from the shadow it left in other genomes. The population is not imaginary. The inference comes from real DNA patterns, but the source group has not yet been matched to a sequenced fossil genome. Think of a family photo with one person cut out while their hand is still resting on someone's shoulder. You cannot see the face, you can still tell someone was there. That is the difference at the center of this story. Neanderthal ancestry outside Africa became famous because scientists could compare living people against a fossil reference. African ghost ancestry became stranger because the reference was missing. The evidence had to be read from the living archive itself. The easier side of the comparison begins in a cave. Neanderthals were not invented by genetics. Their bones had been found for more than a century before the genome arrived. Heavy brow ridges, strong limb bones, large noses, and skull fragments turned up across Europe and Western Asia. For a long time, museums treated them as a dead side branch, close enough to recognize, distant enough to keep separate. Then, ancient DNA changed the room. In 2010, the Max Planck team and collaborators published a draft sequence of the Neanderthal genome, built from small pieces of DNA recovered from ancient bones. Sites such as Vindija Cave in Croatia became part of a new genetic map. Later, higher quality Neanderthal genomes sharpened the picture, including genomes from other caves and time periods. The result disturbed the clean version of human history. Many people outside Africa carried Neanderthal-derived ancestry, often around 1% to 2%, depending on the population and the method used. That may sound small, but across a whole genome, it is a large archive of inherited fragments. A chromosome is not one simple story. It is more like a long shelf of torn pages. Some pages came from recent ancestors, some came from older migrations, a few came from human groups that no longer exist as separate populations. The old migration map now had another layer. Modern humans expanded out of Africa. Somewhere in Western Eurasia, the Near East, or nearby regions, some of them met Neanderthals. Those encounters were not the whole story of humanity, but they were real enough to leave DNA. The descendants of those humans carried Neanderthal fragments into Europe. They carried them farther into Asia. Later migrations carried them into the Americas. In Oceania and parts of Asia, those same human movements overlapped with another extinct human group, the Denisovans, adding another layer to the archive. At first, the pattern looked almost too neat. Outside Africa, small Neanderthal inheritance. Inside much of sub-Saharan Africa, little or none from direct Neanderthal admixture. That fit the idea that Neanderthals lived mainly outside Africa, and that the major interbreeding happened after the out-of-Africa expansion. Then the details complicated the map. East Asian populations often show slightly higher Neanderthal ancestry than many European populations. Scientists have debated why. One explanation involves additional pulses of Neanderthal ancestry in ancestors of East Asians. Another involves dilution in Europe by later ancestry from groups with less Neanderthal DNA. The exact history is still being refined. Even so, the Neanderthal side had strong anchors. There were bones. There were dated archaeological sites. There were ancient genomes that could be compared directly to living genomes. If a stretch of DNA in a living person matched the Neanderthal reference more than expected, the source had a name. The first model broke there, but it broke in a way science could see. A Neanderthal bone could be photographed. A tooth could be held in a gloved hand. A genome could be assembled, checked, and placed beside a modern human genome. The extinct cousin had a file. The African signal did not. That was the hidden tale behind the famous Neanderthal story. The most familiar archaic DNA discovery had an ancient body to answer to. The stranger one appeared as a statistical shadow inside living African genomes, where the source population had not yet stepped forward from a cave, a skull, or a sequenced petrous bone. Researchers had studied African genetic diversity for decades because Africa holds the deepest roots of living human variation. Mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosome lineages, and whole genome comparisons all pointed to a long, complex history inside the continent. But the early public story often flattened that complexity into one phrase: modern humans came from Africa. That statement is true in the broad sense. It is also incomplete. In 2011, geneticist Michael Hammer and colleagues reported evidence suggesting that some African genomes carried DNA from highly divergent populations. Later, genome-wide studies tested similar questions with larger datasets and more advanced models. The names changed from paper to paper, but the puzzle kept returning. Some DNA segments in African populations did not sit comfortably inside a simple, modern human-only tree. Researchers looked at groups such as Yoruba and Mende in West Africa, Biaka and Baka communities in Central Africa, and Southern African populations, including San-related groups. These examples have to be handled carefully. Africa is not one genetic block. No single study speaks for every community. Sampling history, local migration, language, geography, and later mixture all matter. Still, the pattern was hard to ignore. Certain segments looked too divergent to be explained easily as ordinary recent variation. They were not random noise. They sat inside living genomes, inherited through families, copied across generations, and broken into pieces by recombination. Recombination is the shuffling process that cuts ancestral DNA into shorter and shorter segments over time. A long segment can suggest a more recent source. A shorter, more widely scattered signal can point deeper into the past. But age is not the only clue. Researchers also examine how different the sequence is from other modern human DNA. If a stretch split away far earlier than expected, the family tree starts to bend. That is where the old map failed. With Neanderthals, the question was often simple. Does this piece match the known Neanderthal genome? With African ghost ancestry, the question became harder. Why do some pieces look as if they came from a population that separated from the ancestors of modern humans long ago, then later mixed back into the ancestors of living people? There was no neat label to attach. The partial answer was unsettling because it did not name a tribe, a nation, or a modern identity. It pointed to a vanished human population, or perhaps several populations, somewhere in Africa's deep past. These groups may have been related to Homo sapiens. They may have been a deeply separated branch within a structured African population. They may not fit cleanly into the species labels museums like to use. Neanderthal DNA had a famous extinct cousin. African ghost DNA pointed to a cousin without a public face. That made it stranger. A named extinct human can become a museum display. A skull can be measured. A cave layer can be dated. A fossil genome can be downloaded by scientists and compared across studies. A ghost lineage asks researchers to reconstruct a missing person from fingerprints on the walls. The genome kept one more record, but it did not give that record a name. This is where the evidence becomes powerful and fragile at the same time. Powerful, because whole genome data can detect patterns no eye could see in a bone drawer. Fragile, because different statistical models can produce different estimates. The signal may be real, while the exact date, source population, and amount of ancestry remain uncertain. That uncertainty is not a weakness when it is stated clearly. It is part of responsible science. Researchers compare mutation patterns across populations. Mutations are small DNA spelling changes. Most do not do anything dramatic, but they can mark inheritance. If two people share the same rare pattern across a stretch of chromosome, they likely inherited that stretch from a common ancestor. They also compared divergence. Divergence means how long two DNA lineages have been separated. If a segment in a living genome looks unusually different from nearby modern human variation, it may preserve ancestry from a population that had been separated for a long time before mixing back in. Segment length matters too. Every generation, chromosomes are shuffled. Old inherited blocks get chopped smaller. By looking at how long the blocks are and how different they are, researchers can test whether the signal fits recent mixture, older structure, or contact with a deeply separated group. The second layer was stranger. In 2020, Arun Dravasula and Sriram Sankararaman published work in Science Advances arguing that some West African genomes may carry ancestry from an unknown archaic population. Their models suggested that this ghost population could have split from the ancestors of modern humans very far back in time, then contributed DNA to ancestors of some living West African groups. The estimates varied depending on the model. That part matters. The paper did not give the world a simple number to repeat like a slogan. It offered a statistical reconstruction, a best attempt to explain patterns that did not fit the clean tree. Other researchers have proposed different shapes for the same broad problem. Some models describe one ghost population. Others suggest multiple, deeply structured African populations exchanging genes over long periods. Some signals that look archaic can also be affected by ancient population structure within Homo sapiens itself. In other words, the missing branch may not have been a single, isolated species waiting to be named. It may have been a network of African human populations, separated for long stretches, meeting again and leaving DNA and descendants. That is harder to package. It is also closer to what the genome seems to remember. The Neanderthal story still shocks people because it crosses an emotional line. It says our ancestors met another human form and had children with them. The African ghost story crosses a different line. It says even the birthplace of modern humanity was not a simple trunk. It was a continent of deep branches, old separations, and later reconnections. The strongest reveal is this. The stranger, DNA, is not the famous Neanderthal inheritance outside Africa. It is the missing African branch that left descendants without leaving an identified genome. A Neanderthal fragment can point back to a known reference. A ghost fragment points backward into darkness and still says, someone was here. This does not mean every unusual African segment has the same source. It does not mean one modern group is the ghost population. It does not mean living Africans are more archaic than anyone else. That phrase would be scientifically wrong, and morally corrosive. All living humans are modern Homo sapiens. The ancient signal is about ancestry graph complexity. It is about old branches that contributed to living people and then disappeared as separate populations. The living person is not a fossil. The DNA segment is an inherited record. If the inference is even partly right, the old map did not just miss an encounter outside Africa. It missed a network of encounters inside Africa, where deep human lineages may have separated, survived, met again, and folded into the ancestors of people alive now. The human tree was behaving less like a tree. It was beginning to look braided. This matters because the public version of genetics was built around a limited archive. For much of modern DNA research, European samples were easier to collect, easier to fund, and far more common in databases. That shaped what became famous. Neanderthal ancestry in Europeans and Asians was widely reported, repeated, animated, and turned into a cultural fact. African genetic history was older, deeper, and harder to compress into one headline. Africa holds the greatest genetic diversity among living humans because our species spent most of its history there. When some groups expanded out of Africa, they carried only part of that diversity with them. That is called a bottleneck. Imagine a wide river passing through a narrow channel. Water continues on the other side, but not every current passes through equally. A founder effect works in a similar way. When a smaller group helps form a new population, its descendants carry a limited sample of the variation that existed in the larger source population. Over time, migration, isolation, selection, and chance reshape that sample. This is why comparing African and non-African genomes is not like comparing two equal boxes. One box contains much of the older archive. The other contains a powerful record of expansion, bottleneck, and later mixture outside Africa. That imbalance can mislead simple stories. Early studies often had more European genomes than African genomes. Medical databases leaned heavily toward people of European ancestry. Ancient DNA also favored cold regions where DNA survives better, which meant Europe and Northern Asia produced more usable ancient genomes than many tropical regions. Heat, humidity, soil chemistry, and time can destroy DNA before science can read it. So the Neanderthal story had advantages. The bones survived in caves. The DNA could be sequenced. The comparison groups were heavily studied. The public could see the extinct cousin and understand the headline. African ghost ancestry had fewer of those advantages. The continent's deeper diversity required broader sampling, careful local context, and models that could separate ancient population structure from archaic introgression. It also required scientists to resist the old habit of treating Africa as a single origin point, instead of a continent full of human histories. The caveat matters again. Ghost ancestry does not make any living African group less modern. It does not place any group closer to an extinct human on a ladder. It does not turn population genetics into a story of purity or contamination. Those are the wrong categories. The issue is not living people being ancient relics. The issue is that living genomes can preserve fragments from populations no longer visible as separate communities. A person walking through Lagos, Freetown, Yaoundé, Johannesburg, or a small rural village is not a window into some earlier stage of humanity. That person is as modern as anyone in London, Seoul, Chicago, or Lima. Their genome, like every genome, carries pieces of older history. The difference is depth. Because Africa's human history is so old, the branches inside Africa had more time to separate and reconnect before the major out-of-Africa expansion. Some of those older branches may have vanished as distinct populations, while leaving DNA in living descendants. That is the ghost lineage problem. It is not a threat to human unity. It is evidence that unity was never simple. With that protection in place, the title's question comes back into focus. Scientists compared Neanderthal DNA to African ghost DNA. One was stranger. The answer depends on what kind of evidence unsettles you more. Neanderthal ancestry outside Africa is dramatic, but it is also the clearer case. There are fossil bones, there are sequenced genomes, there are known archaeological ranges, there is a rough migration path from Africa into Eurasia, into contact zones, then outward through later populations. African ghost ancestry is harder to see and harder to explain. The source has no confirmed genome. The number of contributing populations is uncertain. The dates depend on models. The signal may involve archaic introgression, deep African structure, or both. That does not make it weaker as a mystery. It makes it more demanding. The clean tree says one branch leaves Africa, meets Neanderthals, and carries a small inheritance around the world. The braided model says Africa itself contained deep human structure, and some of those branches may have mixed back into the ancestors of living people, long before the world was divided into today's labels. The opening shock now looks different. African ghost DNA made the Neanderthal story look simple, because Neanderthals were the extinct humans science could name. Their genome gave researchers a mirror. African ghost DNA offered no mirror. It offered a shadow with edges sharp enough to measure. That is a different kind of testimony. A bone can disappear. A population name can be lost. A cave can remain undiscovered. Yet a chromosome can keep a trace, copied silently through families for tens of thousands of years. The genome can preserve the outline of an encounter, even after the body is gone. So the human family tree is not a clean ladder of replacement. It is not one straight line of progress. It is branches that separated, survived in different places, met again, exchanged DNA, and disappeared into descendants. Neanderthal DNA taught the world that people outside Africa carried traces of an extinct cousin. African ghost DNA suggests something even harder to picture. The deepest chapters inside Africa may include missing human branches whose names are gone, but whose inheritance remains. No pure line, no clean ladder, no superior branch. Neanderthal DNA and African ghost DNA both point to mixture, survival, and missing history. One came with bones and a name. The other came as a shadow inside living genomes, asking science to rebuild a branch from the record it left behind. Subscribe to the Genome Archive for careful genetic history, ancient DNA mysteries, and the parts of the human record most textbooks simplify. The human tree was never clean, because the genome kept records that bones and textbooks did not.